I welcome representatives from the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. And I remind senators that the Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and should be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Officers are also reminded that any claim that it would be contrary to the public interest to answer a question must be made by a minister and should be accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for the claim. So, for the Hansard record, you know what to do. Thank you.
Senator. Thank you. My name is Rosemary Dennings. I'm an acting Deputy Secretary in the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment.
Joanna Stanyan, Assistant Secretary, Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment.
Peter Gooday, Acting First Assistant Secretary, ABARES in the department.
Jared Greenville, Assistant Secretary, ABARES in the department.
Cassandra Kennedy, First Assistant Secretary, Agricultural Policy Division in the same department.
Yeah.
Well done. Thank you very much. Senator McDonald, would you like to kick off? Let you know that I'll have questions I'll put on notice. Sorry to do that to you.
Yes, and look, I'll probably do the same in the interest of time, but thank you all for showing up today. I just want to ask a carry-on question from earlier today with regard to truth in labelling for the dairy industry, particularly around the milk versus juice issue. We had some evidence earlier that ADF didn't believe that there had been a strong argument put to the COAG or the ministerial meetings around why it should be rejected that nuts and so forth could use milk. I just want to know what work you're doing on that.
Certainly. Thank you, Senator McDonald.
So, and while we're at it, plant-based meat.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so certainly, I can comment on that. So in relation to the issue of plant-based meat or products, beverages that might be come from almonds or other products, I can confirm that there was a discussion at the Australian and New Zealand Ministerial Forum on Food Regulation. So Minister Colbeck is the Australian representative, but Minister Littleproud, as the Agriculture Minister, obviously has a very strong interest in that matter. At that forum in November, they agreed that the Food Regulation Standing Committee, which is the officials committee which sits below that ministerial group, should look at the issue of synthetic foods, including giving consideration to plant-based milk, and that work is ongoing. It's a group of officials from the Commonwealth and the states and territories. So that work is continuing and will report back to ministers from the ministerial forum later in the year. So there is certainly active consideration of this issue, and Minister Littleproud, has also, written to food retailers in relation to this matter and has made a number of public statements. So I certainly would say that there is a lot of work underway in this regard. It just might not be apparent to all stakeholders in the sector.
Okay, so it's still going, because I guess if the Department of Agriculture isn't fighting really hard to get this sorted, you can be sure nobody else is. So I encourage you in those efforts and look forward to being annoyingly noisy about this. I also want to talk to you about ABARES. So we've heard evidence today from a number of groups around cost of production data from QDAS and Dairybase. Would like to know what work ABARES is doing, where you're selecting data from, how accurate you think it is, and is it true that there is an invitation to efficient or successful dairy farmers and people are discouraged from providing data if they're not?
Okay, so I can talk to the survey that we run. Mm-hmm. So we run a survey of dairy farmers each year, survey a bit more than 300 in our sample. So that sample's drawn from a population list that's provided to us by Dairy Australia. It's a stratified random sample, so we break the sample up into different size categories of dairy farms and then we select randomly amongst those. So there's no, that's the only qualification, is that you're on the Dairy Australia list and that you come up randomly in our, when we select. We do like to keep farms in the survey for a couple of years because there's some pretty big start-up costs to being involved in this survey. As I said, we've got about 300 sample points. They're spread across the dairy areas. The idea is that we have a sampling strategy that gives us enough farms of the different size categories that we're confident in being able to come up with an estimate of the averages for that dairy region.
So, in the interest of time, could I ask for a copy of that survey? And then I might put the rest of my questions on notice for the department.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's all publicly available, so we can point you
Send
in the
me a
right
link.
direction.
Thanks, Senator McDonald. Senator Hanson.
Thank you. You actually state in your submission here that if you have, the department states that the imposition of the floor price processes pay dairy farmers for milk would run counter to the progress made under Australia's past national competition policy reforms and would have negative outcomes for the dairying industry, the broader agricultural sector and consumers. Can you explain why?
Certainly, Senator Hanson, Rosemary Denninger. So I think some of these points have been covered off in the evidence from the ACCC and others this morning.
This is in your submission.
Yes, I know, and I'm going
So
to expand on that. So if there was to be a minimum price, then the implication of that is that it would mean that it would make our exports less competitive. I understand you've made some comments earlier in relation to exports versus imports, but it would mean that it is harder for our exporters to compete in our markets overseas because the price of their inputs to make cheese or yogurt or other things like that is higher. So it would have a very significant impact on our exports of dairy. The other thing it would do is it would make the cost of cheese and so on that we produce here more expensive because many Australian consumers, of course, also choose Australian cheese. So it makes those products more expensive and therefore consumers might then choose to buy imported cheese rather than domestic cheese. And of course, there might be potential issues with the WTO. And that implication is not just for dairy, but of course Australia exports a whole lot of other
No,
products.
there's only an implication with the WTO, with the World Trade Organisation. If we actually have lower prices and we actually, our exports upset the market and the pricing structure worldwide, isn't it? So we're not in any position whatsoever to impact on world prices in our milk, because the fact is that we've actually dropped from 12 billion litres down to 8 billion litres. We're only exporting 3.2% compared to New Zealand of 19.3%, 19.6% that New Zealand. So if you're worrying about world prices, we're nowhere near going to have an impact on world prices. What we're doing is we're destroying our own domestic market where we won't have the dairy farmers here, that we're going to have to look at importing milk product and cheese into Australia.
Well, I think the other observation I would make in relation to the price of milk is that if we were to increase the price of milk, there would be domestic producers, especially in our southern states, and I know there's been this evidence before, who are still more competitive than those in our northern states. And because it is possible to transport milk, we know that. We know milk is transported to Darwin and to other areas, that if they are unable to sell their milk to either products that can be exported, cheese and so on, or consumed domestically, they will produce milk for human consumption, and they will still be more competitive than the northern states because they have a lower base price. And even when you take into account the trucking costs, there's a real risk there that it would still crowd out some of our northern producers. So I guess what I'm trying to extrapolate is the kinds of flow-on effects from having a floor price or a levy. There are some flow-on implications, and I'm just trying to draw those out for the committee's attention and understanding.
But didn't we have a profitable dairying industry prior to deregulation where we had 22,000 farmers in Australia? Now we've got 5,200. So we've actually destroyed a lot of jobs in our own farming and an industry where I think the government said it's not a necessary industry. The dairy farming industry is not important to the Australian government.
I've not seen any commentary, Senator Hanson, where the government has said that the dairy industry is not important. In fact, I think that moving to introduce a mandatory code and the range of election commitments that the government has implemented, I think, indicates very strongly that the government feels very supportive of the dairy industry and is looking to try and address the egregious behaviours, some of which have been discussed this morning, and try and improve the bargaining power of farmers through things like the mandatory code of conduct and through other assistance to the sector. So I certainly haven't seen any comments in that regard, Senator.
Did you want, sorry, Senator Hanson, did you want to add something, Mr. Goodall?
I think Dr.
Mr.
Greenville
Greenville?
keen.
So just add Jared Greenville here from ABARES, regarding a couple of points regarding our previous profitability under the regulated system. So if you go back to the height of it's in the submission, the height of the regulation system, around 60% of farmer revenues came from effective government transfers or subsidies to the sector. And so now...
Federal subsidies prior to deregulation.
Yes, and so we've transitioned to an industry that is internationally competitive, and so for our farmers, they compete against New Zealand farmers, against other farmers all around the world in quite an effective manner, and a number of them already are. Well, the majority of the industry remains to be profitable. Just also to clarify some points around the WTO. So the way that our commitments work is that we've made commitments based on our own set of policies and they are assessed relative to our own industry. And so it's not a question about whether we influence the world price, it's rather a question about whether or not we are abiding by the commitments that we've made ourselves. And any trade response to that relates to assessments against what we've decided
And they're
ourselves.
more worried about our agreements, free trade agreements with other countries, than our food security for our own nation, for our own people.
So certainly, Senator Hanson, ABARES have done some work which indicates that Australia produces significantly more food than we need
No,
to supply.
I'm not talking about other food. I'm talking about milk. I'm talking about milk production. We used to produce 12 billion litres for 19 million people. Now we're up to 25 million people and we're producing 8 million litres. And even David Littleproud said in his release here, we've lost over 500 dairy farmers in the last 12 months, constantly losing more and more dairy farmers because they cannot produce their milk at cost of production and they're being screwed over. Now, it also is a bit way of life. They have a right to a way of life, but we are not giving them that right by international trade agreements and what we're doing, and you're not prepared to actually consider. In your submission here, you actually said about raising about the wool prices. You said the floor price for wool. Yes, you've got it in your submission. What's that got to do with the price of eggs?
Well, that's a good question, because wool can last sitting on a shelf.
That was 1974, the wool prices. You haven't got an argument there whatsoever as far as I'm concerned. That was paid, that was stored, the wool was stored. Milk doesn't. They actually, we milk a cow twice a day. That milk cannot be stored. It's got to be sold to the public. And the milk, the farmers paid for the milk after the sale. Wool wasn't. A sheep is shorn once a year, so that's no argument to compare it to the wool.
That wasn't the point of the wool
But you
price
you put it in
comparison.
your submission.
The
You
point
put it
of
in
the
your
wool-
submission. That's the reasons why, and you put it back there. I'm sorry, it doesn't hold water with me.
The point of the wool price comparison was how well that scheme had worked, which was not at all really, and it ended up costing taxpayers
Completely
a lot of
different
money
situation.
to sell off
I
that
understand
wool
what
at a
happened
lower price
and the
than what we
bales of
bought it
wool
for.
that were there to hold the price up. This is about the dairy industry. This is milk that cannot be stored. It has to be sold. And the fact is that the Australian consumers are quite happy to pay extra for the milk. So if they're quite happy to pay, and I believe they would pay $1.50 a litre, New Zealand's paying $2.50 a litre. So if the Australian consumer is quite happy to pay $1.50 a litre, why don't you actually put a floor price on the milk that they get paid a reasonable price for their milk that is then passed on to the consumer? What other agricultural industry do we then go back to the retailer and say, well, hang on a minute, you're going to put a levy on that and then we'll send that back to the grower? What other... Tell me.
Certainly, Senator Hanson, as has been discussed earlier today, there are different arrangements whereby the retailer can pay more. So some of our retailers do have contracts directly with farmers, as some of the evidence has been this morning, and also there are some flow-through...
I'm going to be a party pooper here because of the time, but in terms of Senator Hanson's question, for the record, what are the agricultural industries was the question. What was it?
What other agricultural industries do you, at the end of the line, the retailer collects the levy and sends back to the farmer?
Well, I think that has been a response to the feedback that consumers are prepared to make more.
Please.
What?
Well, I'm happy to take it on notice. I wish to answer the question.
You should know. Is there any other industry, agricultural industry, that actually collect the levy and send it back to the farmer?
At the retailer. The retailer collects it.
Yeah.
So the retailer collects the levy, and then the retailer.
What other?
I'm happy to take it on notice. And I'm not aware of any, but I'm happy to take it on notice. That's
all right. Now, I'm sorry because it is 2 o'clock. We're only an hour and a quarter over our time, whatever it was. So thank you very much. Now for the questions on notice. 3rd of July, close of business 3rd of July. Sorry, it's a bit close, but anyway, we'll get them to you. Thank you very much, Broadcasting Hansard. Thanks, guys. Fantastic effort. You. And to James, of course, mate, and you guys and the Secretariat. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
And my fellow senators, that concludes today's hearing. The committee now stands adjourned.
Thank you.